Thanks to all of you who are out. Thanks to you, the streams. We were a little bit later on the streams this morning. That's all right. Appreciate each one of you, and we're thankful for the Lord's help. We're in the book of Isaiah, chapter 59, and of course, if you were here on Thursday evening, you know we preached through the first 12 verses of this chapter. So we were on verse 13 this morning, and we are looking at a subject of what happens when there is no intercessor. Besides, I actually titled the sermon this morning, There Is No Intercessor. Because it's a situation that was happening in Israel. You know, if you look at a person's life and there is some kind of issue going on, one of the best things that can happen is for there to be an intercessor. Now, I think where this happens very often in our lives is with kids, because one kid will do something that wasn't quite as good as it should have been, and one of the parents will be extremely upset about it, and maybe the other parent might intercede a little bit, trying to at least soften the blow a bit. There is an intercession that happens. There is also an intercession the Bible tells us about, that the Holy Spirit makes intercession for us according to the will of God. That's what it tells us in Romans, that the Holy Spirit's working on our behalf. It tells us even that he interprets our prayers with groanings and utters that cannot be uttered. So God is working on our behalf. But what happens in a nation where there is no intercessor? Because this is what Isaiah is talking about, Isaiah 59. When there is no intercessor to stand before a nation, to stand before a group. You know, there is a very well-known city group in the Bible. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. Probably most people will know it. Even one of our English words is derived from it. The Sodomites comes from actually Sodom, the act of being with a man being with another man. It comes right from that very word, because that's what it was known for. Sodom and Gomorrah. We find out that God pours out brimstone upon them. But I want to tell you there's something very interesting about Sodom, and is that they actually had an intercessor. There was someone that stood before God for Sodom. It was actually Abraham. And of course, if you remember the story, God begins to work with Abraham, let him know what's going to happen. And eventually they get down to where if there was just 10 righteous people, they would save the nation. The city in this case, but they were more like nations at that time. City-states basically were nations. And yet we find there wasn't 10 righteous people, that God sent fire and brimstone down, and the angel comes in and takes Lot and his family out. Lot, well, not really his family, Lot and his wife, his 2 daughters. But you look at the situation, you realize there was an intercessor. But what happens when there's no intercessor at all? Because that's what Isaiah said was going to happen in Israel. Let's look at it here at verse number 13 of Isaiah chapter 59. Here's what it says. It says in verse 13, "And transgressing and lying against the Lord, and departing from our God, speaking oppression and revolt, concerning and uttering from the hearts words of falsehood, and judgment is turned away backward, and justice standeth afar off. For truth is fallen in the street, and iniquity cannot enter. Yea, truth faileth, and he that departeth from evil maketh himself a prey. And the Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no judgment. And he saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore his arm brought salvation unto him, and his righteousness it sustained him." You know, it's interesting when people look at America, because for a long time, at least 200 years or so, America kind of stood as the pinnacle of what Christianity was supposed to be. It was a nation that largely found upon God. It's very interesting if you go to the various things, especially in Washington, D.C., and you go to the different memorials. If you go to the Lincoln Monument or the Washington Monument, or if you were to go to the Supreme Court and look upon the pillars, you'll find something very interesting. On each one of those pillars and things, and on these memorials, is inscribed all kinds of scriptures. There are Bible verses written all over them. It is very obvious that in Washington's case, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and the different Supreme Courts, you know what you find? You find the inscriptions written all over them about the work of God written in their hearts. I have a feeling that if you would have been in Israel at the time that Isaiah was writing this, I know for sure there were all kinds of memorials that were set up. There were places where there was rocks that were set up that symbolized certain things. You might remember that at the River Jordan, when they crossed over Jordan, God parted the seas, and they came across the river to Canaan land. You'll know they set up some pillars as a memorial that God had brought them through. They could look way back and they could see how God had helped in the situation with Egypt. It was one of the pinnacles of Israel. It was how they came out of the slavery of Egypt, how God had sent the plagues upon them and how God had worked. There was all kinds of evidences, and there's a lot of evidences in people's lives today. You can look back across the different preachers across the years. Probably many of us were aware of one. I know that just recently, I'm not sure if it was today or I know it was sometime during this week, Dr. Noel Scott died. He was a well-known evangelist. He was the president of one of the Bible colleges for a while. I remember Brother Noel Scott actually holding a revival at Penview one time when I was a student. I believe he died either today or sometime this week. But you hear about and you see evangelists that live for God and people that did things. We have all kinds of evidences. There's all kinds of proofs. If there was any nation that had all kinds of proofs, it was Israel, because it was God's chosen people. And yet we find that Isaiah says there's going to come a point when there's not even going to be an intercessor. You know, really, there are, I find Jeremiah, this is the prophet after Isaiah, one of the most interesting prophets in the Bible, because he's one that's given a mission that most of us would look like as a mission of failure. Because he's told to go out and preach, and no one's going to listen to you. No one's going to hear what you say. Don't expect anyone to come to the word signs. Don't even pray for the people. It's an amazing thing when it gets to that point. When God says, don't even intercede anymore. I'm not interested anymore in this people. And it's exactly what begins to happen. We find that Israel is carried away into Babylon. But I want to tell you what God says was going to happen. He says it's going to get to a place where there's no intercessor, where there's no one that's going to stand before. And then God says this, I am going to stand up in my righteousness. You know, I find this very interesting that a lot of people really kind of believe that God's not involved in things. They believe that God doesn't know what's going on, that God doesn't care. Besides, Proverbs talks about this. It says, God hath forgotten, he hideth his face, he will never see it. That's what it says in Psalms 10, that the wicked says in his heart, God's forgotten, he hideth his face, he'll never see it. And yet God is working in the actions of man. He's working, and it says he's doing something. And in verse 17, here's what it says. He says, for he put on righteousness as a breastplate, and a helmet of salvation upon his head. And he put on the garments of vengeance for clothing, and was clad with zeal as a cloak. And then he says in verse 18, according to their deeds, according he will repay. Fury to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies. To the islands he will repay recompense. You know, I heard a sermon a couple years ago, and generally most of it is probably like yours. Most people don't remember much of what I say, and that's okay. But I heard a sermon a couple years ago that I actually remember a bit of it very well, because it kind of stood out in my mind. And it was basically this. It was basically saying that it was a preacher that was asking whether in 10 years what the church would even look like. And that's now been 2 years ago. And I actually wondered about that for a bit. Because, see, the situation is kind of becoming a lot like Israel's was. Most of the leaders are dying off or have died off. And what's beginning to happen is that the iniquity is taking over everything. We look at it, there is all kinds of problems across the world right now. I would say that there have always been problems. There have been major problems even. There were the world wars, both of World War I and World War II. But I would say this morning that probably in all of history, I don't know that there has been a more dangerous position that the world is in than they're in right now. See, there's all kinds of talks about different things. There's talks about nuclear weapons, and I'm not trying to scare anyone. There's lots of things going on. I think I heard that Iran is now at 90% enrichment on uranium, which is just 10% short of being able to fire nukes. You have North Korea, which is partnered with Russia, that has been trying to get nuclear weapons for a long time, probably isn't far away either. You have all of these different places, and there's nuclear weapons and the threat of it. There's wars going on. We're very aware of them. You have the Russia-Ukraine. You have the civil wars going on in Venezuela. All across the Eastern Africa, there is wars going on, most of them civil wars. There's all kinds of wars going on. You have Israel and Hamas, Israel and Lebanon, all of these different places. You know what we see? We see tension. We see the wanting to set up bases. You know, obviously most of us are pretty aware, whether you're for it or not. You know, Trump trying to set up things in the island of Greenland, mostly for defense purposes, mostly military bases to try to prevent possible nuclear strikes from Russia. There's all kinds of things going on. There's tension. There's tension around the world. And the reality is very simple. When God begins to be left out in people's minds, the only thing left is tension. There's no peace. The Bible is very clear. We talked about that just a couple weeks ago. There's no peace for the wicked. There's nowhere to turn. They look at, they can't find the answer, because really the answers are found in God. And when you leave him out, we get what we have here. There was no justice, no equity. I want you to think about a judge who is supposed to make a decision. I know I mentioned it a couple of times. My brother was on a jury here very recently, actually the last few months. He's had to go in 2 or 3 times for jury duty, make decisions about things. But you see, there's a foundation that's laid out. In this foundation, it basically gives out what should be termed as guilty or innocent, and the penalties are set forth. And so when you look at it, you can come to an agreement on whether or not someone is innocent or guilty. We have all of these different things. Now, I want you to think about a court case, though. A person comes before the court case where there is no real rules set up. You know, a person comes before the jury, they're like, well, you have no rules, you have no regulations, but we want you to come up with what you think about this man. And so there's no foundation, there's nothing, and we never know what they'll come up with, because there's nothing to go by. Now I want you to think about the world for a moment. All right, and we're going to bring this around to God here in just a moment. I want you to think about the world for a moment. They come up with some kind of action or some kind of new thing. And now we have to determine whether or not this new thing is right or wrong. And now the only thing that the world has to judge by is their own thinking. I remember talking to a man for a couple hours, not too long ago actually, but the whole idea of it was that he felt like that his thinking was greater than God's. Besides, he actually felt like there was no God at all. That he knew what was morally right and wrong because he was intelligent and smart, and believed that he had the ability and the knowledge to be able to decide what was right and wrong. But see, this is commonly what we do in our world. We don't really know for sure what to do, and so we throw out the Bible and we make up our own rules. And so this is what happens in government all the time. The nation that was once founded upon the things of God, where to be a lawyer, you had to know the Bible. It was used in court. It was the #1 evidence. Now, instead of that, you have people that come to court and they use their own ideas. They go to college somewhere, some university. I'm not putting down the different universities, but they go to some big law school somewhere, or somewhere that has a prestigious name. They get a position, and now all of a sudden they're making up their own rules and laws. They gather in a room, they get together, they use all of their knowledge and thoughts, and they come together with a book of laws, except for they left out God entirely. And so there's no chance for the laws to have any chance of ever being good or right, because they're made by the thoughts of man. And so what happens is we have what has began to happen. We have laws and ideals and thoughts that are created by man. We have engineering things and philosophies and mathematicians and grammar and science, and it's all found on the ideals of man. So much so that now we have confusion on the various things that are very easy to see in life. Things that a little child could tell you are now being confused. Scientists will tell you there's 5 or 6 different things that something can be, It may or may not be this. And so we've got to the point where, in reality, we believe that we came from a whole bunch of little cells, and that we came from little amoebas and bacteria and fish and gorillas, and you can go down the line. We could go down it. It goes on for a long time. That because we can't really figure out how to make it all work, we've added billions of years to this world. And so we have a whole group of ideals and theologies and thinking that's been created by man. And I want to tell you what's happened. What's happened is that there's been a loss of justice and judgment. There's been a loss of what's good and right. And God says that he will work, whether or not men want him to work or not. Look at verse number 18 in Isaiah chapter 59. He says, according to their deeds, accordingly he will repay. Fury to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies. To the islands he will pay recompense. So shall they fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. When the enemy shall come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him. I want to talk to you for just a moment of what happened in the biblical days. Because most of us, whether we know it or not, we're probably familiar with a king. The king has a very long name, and if you want to have a name that's rather difficult to spell, and is actually spelled two different ways in the Bible, you'll come up with this king named Nebuchadnezzar. He's some of the prophets recognize him as Nebuchadnezzar, some recognize him as Nebuchadnezzar, but a very big king. This king is the king of Babylon. And really, if you want to go through the list of kings, I know Alexander the Great is considered very powerful. You know, he was in around the 300 ADs. But I want to tell you that Nebuchadnezzar was probably more powerful than Alexander the Great. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. Besides, he was not really the king of Babylon. He was the king of the world, practically. Because the issue was very simple. During the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and God even tells Nebuchadnezzar this, I raised you up for this cause. It was to raise up judgment against the nations. Nebuchadnezzar was raised up for one reason, and that was literally to destroy everything, practically. He was one of the most ruthless kings that you'll find in the entirety of history. He would go into places, and he didn't just want to take over the places. He wanted to destroy everything, basically. He would burn down things. He would tear down things. Really wanted to wipe out all recognition of the people, practically. It is a miracle in itself that he even saved Israel, because Nebuchadnezzar was not known for saving things. He destroyed things. That's what he did. There's all kinds of cities that are mentioned in the Bible, countries that Nebuchadnezzar completely wiped out, and there is very little to even remind them in history about them, except for the Bible, because they were so obliterated by Nebuchadnezzar. He's a very ruthless king. But he was raised up for one reason, that was to do the judgment of God. He didn't even know that's what he was to do. Because see, the reality is that there will be things that happen in life. You look at history, and I want to tell you what you find. From the greatest nations of all time, you can go down and look throughout all history. You can go to any point in history. You want to go back to Egypt, who was one of the greatest nations of all time during around the year 2000. One of the strongest nations, and of course we know from the Bible what happened to them as God judged the nation, but Egypt was the strongest nation in the world for a long time until God intervened. Then you go from Egypt, and you have all kinds of little things. You had the Philistines that were a little bit strong. You had, obviously, Israel became a nation and became very strong under David and Solomon. After them, though, there becomes some of the largest empires in the world. You had Assyria, Babylon, you had Greek, Roman. I say all this, we recognize these names. You know, you recognize the Roman Empire. You might recognize the Ottoman Empire, one of the strongest empires during the Dark Ages. The Mameluke Empire, all of the Chinese dynasty empires, the Jings and the Yangs and all the different ones. I mention all of these to tell you that every nation and every country has always had a time of testing where they were given up and they were given a time to figure out the things of God. And I want to tell you that God says he lifts up a standard. And the reality is very simple. If America and the church continue away from God, which they have for a long time, you're going to run into a problem. You're going to come up against the standard of God. See, right now in America, there's really not a lot of people anymore that promote the standard of God. Besides, if you do, you will be ridiculed heavily, but about doing the things of God, because God says something. My standard is this. In verse 20, he tells what his standard is. He says this, and the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them shall turn from the transgression Jacob, saith the Lord. As for me, this is my covenant, saith the Lord. My spirit that is upon thee, and my words shall I put in thy mouth, shall not depart out of thy mouth, nor out of the mouth of thy seed, nor out of the mouth of thy seed, saith the Lord, from henceforth and forever. God had a standard. He was going to send a Redeemer. You know, the wonderful thing for us this morning is that we have the knowledge of knowing who the Redeemer was. It was Jesus Christ. But you know, God wasn't just interested in saving one person or one group of people. He was interested in saving the world. The amazing thing is that God wasn't just interested in saving Israel. Now, we know that Israel was God's chosen people, and it was who God worked for. But God wasn't just interested in saving Israel. He was interested in saving each one of us. God was interested in working in every single one of our people's lives. You know, God is interested in working in America today. He's interested in working in Russia, Africa, China. Besides, he's working in those very countries now. Iran has one of the strongest underground churches in the world. But we look at all of these different things. God is working in people's lives. The question is, are we going to hearken to the things of God? Because you see, Israel had a choice. God said what he was going to do. Some people say, well, why in the world did Israel get carried away off to Babylon? And in the Bible actually tells us exactly why. It says in Acts chapter 7, here's what it says. It says, yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch, and the star of your god Rephaim, and worship them, rejoice in the work of their own hands. You know what a lot of people are doing this morning? They're worshiping in the work of their own hands. They really are. They're worshiping in the work that they do. They're worshiping in the sports that they've created, the shopping that we've created. It's amazing to me how much money is spent in advertising, how your entire life is literally spied upon. It literally is. Google, Apple, Facebook, all of them, they all do the same thing. They take your information, your revenue, they sell it to whoever will take it. You know why? So they can sell more products, so they can advertise more things. They get more things that you like. You know why? Because we figured out something. If we just play to man's desires, and we do what man wants to do, and we let man's ideals become the reality, you know what happens? Everybody's happy. They really are. They're happy, but you know what happens though? They're happy, but their lives don't reflect that happiness. You see, in Rome, they became one of the strongest nations in the world. They had everything that you could ever ask for, and I want to tell you what happened in Rome. With everything they ever asked for, that you could ever dream of, Rome was the pinnacle of everything. And you know what happened in Rome? Let me tell you what the most exciting thing to do in Rome was. You know what it was to do? It was to go to the amphitheater. It was to go to the amphitheater and watch people get killed, basically. Send out lions out into there and watch them rip people apart, especially Christians. Burn different places if you disagreed with them. Whatever it took. The gladiators would come out. Then they'd have the centurions, the big army. You know what it was? If Caesar didn't like you, it was off with your head. Besides, a lot of times it was off with your head just to put into the fact that Caesar was the ruler. You look at them, and you look at their lives, and you find out that some of the emperors of Rome were some of the most evil people you could ever meet. Literally would create wax statues of people throughout history. You see what happens? It was because it was man's ideal that became the forefront. I want to tell you what happens when man's ideal becomes the forefront. I'm bringing you to a close here. We're about to conclude. When man's ideal becomes the forefront, there's evil that comes out of it. It becomes evil entertainment. It becomes evil pleasure. I'm amazed at some of the songs that are written today that are played as top music songs. I mean, they're like our hits, and they're quite evil, to be honest. The wording is terrible. And this is what we put ourselves into and say, this is our entertainment. This is our culture. This is what we want. And so now I talked to a gentleman the other day. We're bringing it to a close here. when I talked to him, you know what? He thought it was terrible. It was terrible that there would be an idea that it should only be for one man and one woman. He just felt like that was terrible. Thought people should be able to sleep around, do whatever they wanted. It was all up to a person's feeling, whatever they wanted to do. You see, this is commonplace thought now. Let me do what I want to do. I don't care if somebody else gets violated along the way. You know, Daniel just had an incident the other day, you know. There's terrible things that happen in our society. Why? Because we've left out God. And when there's no standard, this is what happens. When there's no standard in the family, this is what happens. You take God out of the government, this is what happens. We have rules and regulations, and no one knows why we have half of them. And so we go from one president to the next. You know what they do? They just undo all the regulations of the last one, and they create their own new regulations. Whether they're right or wrong, it really doesn't matter. It's what we've done. It's all regulations of man. And I want to tell you, until you get your life settled on the things of God, on the Bible, and on what God has to say about things, you know what's going to happen? You're going to have a life that goes like this. It goes up and down like the sea. Because you know why? Because man's ideals will get you into all kinds of trouble. They will. Sometimes they'll work. Sometimes they won't. But I'll tell you this. When you get your eyes focused on God, you'll find something. God's standard stands forever. And God says, I've raised up a standard. And that standard is through Jesus Christ. Do you know Jesus this morning? That's really the question. Have you given him your life? Is he the Lord of your life? Because God says he's the standard. He's the salvation of Israel, and he's really the salvation for each one of us. Let's put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ. Thanks to all of you who come out. Thanks to you through the streams. We appreciate your support. Pray that you have a wonderful afternoon in the Lord. You prayed up, blessed up, and ready to go. Have a wonderful day.